Do you, in the United States, you're seeing everywhere signs of spiritual renewal, Christian religious revival. Are you sensing that in Europe since you live there?
Did you know that while Christianity is slowly showing signs of revival in America, it is in absolute decline across Western Europe in countries like France, Netherlands, Germany, and the UK? It is really difficult to comprehend how Western Europe, once the very heart and stronghold of Christianity, the cradle of Christian civilization, could lose its faith so completely. In many of these countries today, practicing Christians make up barely 2% of the population. Churches stand empty, belief has collapsed, and what has replaced Christianity often looks less like neutral secularism and more like a return to a kind of modern paganism. So how did the most Christian part of the world end up like this? In the first clip, Eva describes how simply speaking about God now leads to ridicule and mockery in these societies. Let's listen.
Not nearly as much as I would like to. No. Europe is a highly secularized continent, especially Northwestern Europe. Also, for context, it was like when I started doing commentary for a more American audience, I noticed and involved myself more in American politics. I really noticed how often people talk about their faith in God, how often he is mentioned, and how often they speak about Jesus also in political discourse. Now, you can have your opinions about that, whether it's always genuine or not, but he's mentioned. Here,
Yes.
if you do that in Europe, you get ridiculed. People will look at you funny. I grew up in a country where if you said you were a Christian, people would immediately say, how is that possible? Don't you have a university education? Like, that's so stupid. Like, how come that you believe in a fairy tale? That is like the status quo in my country. And I think that also explains why we've gone down the deep end as far as we have, because people don't recognize even, they don't recognize the idea or the concept of good and evil. So if you don't see that, if you don't believe that God exists, if you don't believe that good exists, then you don't believe that evil exists. And so you will just always write it off as incompetence at best. Or you'll say, no, that's just a different viewpoint, or everything is relative. And that's exactly what has gotten us, what has gotten us where we are today.
Now, when a society openly ridicules God, the outcome shouldn't surprise us. Now, having said that, as Pope Benedict XVI once explained, the Church's mission rests on three essential pillars: the preaching of the gospel, right worship, and service to the poor. When these pillars are held together, faith remains alive and coherent. When one collapses, the whole structure weakens. In my judgment, the Catholic Church in much of Europe has struggled particularly with leading its people into right worship. One of the clearest indicators of this struggle is the sight of empty pews in many churches. When God is no longer worshipped rightly, people do not simply stop worshipping. Rather, their worship is redirected. Gradually, comfort, pleasure, politics, identity, success, and ultimately the self begin to occupy the space once reserved for God. And the more people center their lives around these substitutes, the further they drift from transcendence and from God himself. Over time, this shift reshapes an entire culture. Faith becomes peripheral, optional, and increasingly private. Christianity no longer forms the imagination or the moral instincts of society. This, I would argue, has significantly contributed to the decline of Christianity across much of Europe, not primarily through external hostility, but through a slow erosion of right worship at its very core. In the next clip, Eva explains how, as God has been pushed out of the picture in Europe, many young people have lost their sense of purpose and are living increasingly meaningless lives. Let's listen.
Yeah, I was about to ask, how's that worked out for the Netherlands? Pretty well? Pretty great? Mocking God? Good long-term strategy?
Exactly. I mean, the country is on a great path, isn't it? So, indeed, really, really bad long-term strategy, but also really, really bad short-term strategy, because people aren't happy. Young people aren't fulfilled. They don't know what to do with their lives. They lack purpose. They lack meaning. You of course you do. So it's both bad in the long run and in the short run. But it's very much the case. I mean, I converted to Catholicism a couple of years ago personally, in the UK, by the way, where I now can't go. Yeah, great. But only 2.7%, for example, of the Dutch population is a practicing Catholic. And in the Netherlands, it's half-half. You have 50% is in name, at least, is Protestant, 50% is Catholic. And only 2.7% is practicing. That tells you the situation of my homeland.
When young people live without a clear sense of purpose, society doesn't slowly decline. It unravels into a deep emptiness and loss of meaning. And that is a dangerous sign for any society because young people play a vital role in keeping faith alive, embodying it in daily life and handing it on to the next generation. When that transmission breaks down, faith no longer remains an integral part of society. It gradually loses its hold, recedes from public life, and eventually fades into oblivion. Tell me if this is not what we are witnessing today in Western Europe. This collapse didn't happen overnight, nor was it accidental. In the next clip, Bishop Robert Barron explains how the two world wars became a spiritual catastrophe for Europe. Let's listen.
To me, mid-20th century, and I think in Europe, the world wars, I think they had obviously a devastating effect at the economic and political level, but I think they also had a devastating effect at the spiritual level. When you have, Stanley Hauerwas used to say this, the World War I and II, you have Canadian Christians killing German Christians, killing Austrian Christians,
right.
killing Russian Christians, killing American Christians, killing French Christians. It's a Christian, there were Jews and others involved, of course, but mostly it was this awful civil war among Christians. Now, if you go down the total Hauerwas route, who were privileging their national identity over their religious identity. I do think there's something to the view that something happened to the European spirit, something happened to the Christian spirit in this orgy of violence in both World War I, World War II, and add the Holocaust on there. Something broke. Now, along with that would be this withering critique coming from, a kind of a post-Enlightenment rationalism, a materialism, a secularism, which found its way from the universities into the general population. Let's say around the year 1600, everybody in Europe would have believed in God and that a good life is in relation to God and that there's a heaven and the transcendent realm. That's been true of all of human history. And it's really only in pretty recent times, in the grand scheme of things, that people began to question all that. And that what he calls the buffered self emerged, the self that has a buffer between self and anything transcendent. So yes, in the grand scheme, it's a very recent phenomenon.
What else could we expect when Christians spent years killing one another? It is painfully clear that Europe has never fully recovered from the wounds and scars left by the two world wars. Those conflicts did not simply end with ceasefires and treaties. They inflicted deep psychological, moral, and spiritual damage on entire populations. We can say with confidence that they had a devastating and lasting effect on the people of Europe. That legacy still shapes the continent today. Too often, when conflict erupts, we assume that once the fighting stops, everything will eventually be forgotten, that people will simply move on and life will return to normal. But hostility and unresolved conflict rarely disappear without leaving a trace. They leave wounds, and those wounds have consequences that extend far beyond the original moment of violence. We see this clearly within families. A child raised in a peaceful, loving home grows up very differently from a child raised in an atmosphere of constant tension, anger, and hostility. Even when they reach adulthood, those early wounds do not magically vanish. They resurface in marriages, friendships, habits, and patterns of behavior, quietly shaping how a person relates to others and to the world. Now, if conflict at the level of an individual or a family can leave such deep and lasting scars, imagine the impact when millions of people are killed across entire nations. That kind of trauma does not heal quickly. It embeds itself in culture, memory, and identity, and it often takes generations to even begin the process of recovery. In the next clip, Bishop Robert Barron explains why, despite this history, there has been a notable revival of Christianity in America. Let's listen.
Go back like 5-10 years, a lot of people thought, this is just going to continue forever. The nuns are increasing. And they were indeed. Year after year, you'd see it increase. In the early 70s, it was something like 3% of our country would have claimed no religion. Think of that now. So 97% of our country would have said, when I was a kid, of course I believe in God, I belong to a church. And then, as you say, up to 25, 26, about the 30% figure maybe. But it looked like a steady decline, a steady increase in disaffiliation.
Right.
So the fact that, at least it's kind of stopped. It has not, and maybe even gone down a little bit, is remarkable. It is remarkable. And it also congrues with my own, as you say, kind of anecdotal experience of talking to people, and hearing, especially from younger people, where there's like a renewal of interest in these religious matters.
How about what you're seeing online?
Yeah, that's what I mean is, when I started out years ago, you had a lot of aggressive, disciples of the new atheists who are rehearsing all of Dawkins and Hitchens and all those arguments, and aggressive. That religions is not just stupid; it's morally corrupt and it's horrible. And I have noticed a change. I've noticed that younger people they're more curious about religion, and we can go into some of the personalities maybe who played a role in that of helping us to see there's a more serious dimension to religion. The other thing too, Matt, I think the scandals.
Right.
It's always tricky to read the impact of the scandals, but now they are receding a bit into memory, and the churches have responded to them. And I always want to make that point. We did respond at the institutional level massively to the scandals, and the numbers have declined dramatically. So I wonder if those two things have allowed the scandals a bit to recede, because you'd hear that a lot like 20 years ago. How could you possibly accept this crazy religion and these deeply corrupt people that run it? So I wonder, as that has been addressed institutionally and is fading a bit more into memory, is that stopping this trajectory?
That's really important to highlight. It's not just the passage of time, it's that it was addressed, has been addressed, and continues to be addressed.
And that the numbers have indeed radically fallen. There's no question about that. The sex abuse problems peaked late 60s, 70s, early 80s. We can very clearly remark that, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. And then it's the scandals break, and then 2002, the church begins its formal institutional response, which has continued apace for the past 20 some years, and the numbers have plummeted.
Right.
So yeah, I think.
Finally, let me say this. I truly believe that what we are beginning to witness in America will one day re-emerge in Europe, a renewal of the Catholic faith. History reminds us that faith often looks weakest just before a period of renewal begins. Just to share a personal anecdote, there was a time when I was so inspired by seeing Catholic nuns in Hollywood films that I dreamed of moving to UK, hoping to encounter religious sisters in real life. But God had other plans, and instead I found myself in Australia. And in the last 3 years I've been here, I'm yet to encounter a Catholic nun. That absence is striking in what is still considered a Christian country. I long for the day when I can walk into a church in Australia and see the full life of the church made visible, families with children, young people, religious sisters, consecrated singles, brothers and priests, all gathered together in worship. What a sight that would be. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.